both the traditional and the MMI interview prep for all of our BSMD candidates. So now a lot of schools are starting to send in their applications. And so if you do have any questions, if you have any interviews that are coming up, please feel free to start sending in your questions. We're going to cover a lot of ground on both the traditional and the MMI prep session. But first, we're going to explain a little bit about us and why you should be listening to us. So my name is Lindsay. I am a counselor at MoonPrep. I have worked previously as a writer and an SAT, ACT tutor, and have been with MoonPrep for the last several application cycles, kind of guiding students just like you throughout the application process. I'll let Darlene introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darlene. I am a third-year medical student, a little bit newer to MoonPrep, but not to consulting and prepping students. I've had about over 5 years of helping students get into both MD and DO schools.
Perfect. Yep, so we're just two of the members on the MoonPrep team. We have a lot of different independent college counselors, and we work with students virtually and guide them throughout the college admissions process, but of course, also through their high school journey as well. And so the counselors at MoonPrep will really serve as your guide and mentor to our students. So we might do stuff like help younger students pick their classes, help them narrow down their career interests to choose a major, summer research opportunities or internships or shadowing experiences, building up those resumes so that you are competitive to this program. But a lot of you probably are maybe juniors or seniors kind of preparing for this interview process. And so for our seniors, we've really been guiding them throughout the entire application process really closely. So that goes from everything from helping pick out traditional and BSMD programs, essays, and of course, we've arrived to the interview portion of the season. And so you can imagine, we're really with our students 100% of the way, with the nights, weekends, kind of guiding them throughout this process, working with students all over the country, applying to programs all over the country too, because our goal really is to fill the gap that may arise from like a busy high school counselor who might not have time to help with all of these like small items for their students, like when to send SAT scores or transcripts or how to write the best personal statement and things like that. And so that's really where we'll come in and kind of guide students throughout that process. And so, as you can tell by the whole subject of this webinar, we focus really heavily on these highly selective programs called BSMD, direct med programs, BSDO. And we do actually work with about 80% of our, I guess I should say 80% of our students are either direct med or medical school students. So we spend a lot of time with students just like yourselves, and really guiding us throughout that whole entire process. Now, if you are a senior who is looking for advice, we do have a special offer that we're offering through the end of the week. And this is one interview prep session with a MoonPrep counselor. And it doesn't matter what type of interview you have, if it's an MMI or a traditional interview, we'll make sure that you're 100% prepared. So you'll have one session with us. We'll give you an interview guide with tons of practice questions. We'll give you feedback on your answers so that you can become as strong as possible. And we always record our mock interview sessions too, so that we can send it to you and you can see, your body language, your tone of voice, all those little things that can help distinguish you in a virtual interview. And so if you would like to take advantage of that offer, my email's down there at the bottom, just lindsay@moonprep.com. And so you can start doing some interview practice with an experienced counselor. And Darlene was just telling me before this call that definitely one size does not fit all for, I guess, these interview prep sessions. We want to make sure that you are portraying yourself to the best of your ability, that you really have experienced advice behind you, and you'll hear a lot about our do's and don'ts later on, but that we're really guiding you throughout that process. So you're going to hear a lot of different advice from us today, but I'll let Darlene take it over with more specifics about the interview.
So one thing I like to start out with is why people are getting interviews, right? So a lot of the times I think people tend to forget, how to even approach an interview because they're so excited, right? BSMDs are so competitive. You never thought you would make it this far. And now you're kind of at the last and final step, right? But like everything else, my favorite part about interviewing is that you can actually practice it. So the first step is, usually to think, why did they invite me? And I like to bring up the AAMC competencies. This is it's like an organization where you apply for medical school, and they kind of list out the qualities that all of the schools have collectively come together and decided what qualities are we looking for in a medical student. So there's going to be interpersonal skills, thinking and reasoning, and science. So most people have the science down, probably the thinking and reasoning, but from what I've seen more recently, there's a lot of new focus on interpersonal and intrapersonal skills, meaning working in a team, making sure you're able to build rapport with patients, not just diagnosing and, just throwing a treatment at them. So all of your statements that you give when you're interviewing have to be backed up by evidence and reasoning. So even if you don't know that much about medicine, and especially at a high school level when you're interviewing for a BSMD school, they don't expect you to have that knowledge, but they want you to be able to reason things out logically, and that is what is going to make you stand out stronger. And the last thing I want to point out is that all medical schools are looking for someone who is curious and a lifelong learner. So, the journey from now until you're a doctor is probably over 12 years. So they don't want you to just feel like, oh, I can learn everything in, the first 6 years from undergrad to my, to the preclinical years, and then just give up everything and just start practicing, right? It doesn't work that way. Medicine is always changing. So that means there's always new information, new technology, and the information that we have now quickly gets outdated. So that's why these qualities are super important to know.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself. Yes. So interviews are definitely changing. And even now this year, we've noticed that some have started off as hoping to be in person and then have switched to be virtual just because as like the Omicron variant rears its very ugly head, interviews have just turned back to virtual. And so most of my students who thought they were going to have in-person interviews have ended up being virtual again this year. But then I have heard rumors that there are going to be some later on this year to be in person. And so no matter what, really, if this is an in-person or a virtual interview, you're going to want to look professional. And so a lot of the times it will be kind of like a full day event. So you want to be professional, but also comfortable. So wear comfortable shoes that you can walk around in, clothes that you would feel, able and confident in the whole time. So a lot of the times the interviews, regardless of whether it's virtual or in person, it's going to be a full day. So Zoom fatigue is real, as well as just in-person fatigue as well. So a lot of the times you'll get an intro into the school and the mission of the values. Might be like a short presentation. A lot of the times they also will take you on a tour because they want you to get excited about the place too. And then you'll have either one interview or sometimes several interviews, and then also like a Q&A with students or faculty where you can learn more about like the culture of the campus and things like that. And so one thing that I've really noticed is that you'll follow kind of a similar format even in virtual. So sometimes students are having 8-hour days. On Zoom as well, we'll really have like a very similar kind of format here. Getting the intro, you're maybe watching a video tour instead. You're still having kind of that Q&A and 1 or 2 interviews. And so it's a little bit easier because you are from the comfort of your own home. But for virtual interviews, it definitely does have kind of its more challenges that you'll have to overcome. And that could just be like technological challenges. So we always want to make sure that you do arrive on time, but also you don't arrive too early because they might be using the same link for multiple people. We don't, especially if it is MMI, you have to be going to the exact right station and the right Zoom link at the right time. So you might have several links that you have to be pressing depending on what interview, depending on if it's a Q&A, whatever it might be. So you want to make sure that you do have your links in order. You also want to check your background, and this is why interview prep is so key. Whenever we do interview prep with our students, we're not just critiquing them, we're critiquing the lighting, we're critiquing, what's behind them. Is it distracting? Can you see like their messy bed in the background? All those types of things. And even though it is virtual, you still have to be professional from the top up. And honestly, dressing professionally the whole way through can kind of just help set that ambiance too for yourself and keep you focused throughout the interview, because it is a full day event. And last but not least, we really want you to try and make eye contact with the camera. And so this is also something we practice to see where students are looking. Are they looking away the whole time? Are they, using their hands too much like I always do? So kind of paying attention to those types of things so that students can start to get to know how they are seen virtually, if that ends up being the case for their interviews.
So obviously MoonPrep has its own interview guide, and I believe it's free on the website, right? Yeah. And I actually took a look at this the other day, and it's actually very thorough. So, but other places to get good questions is SDN. This is probably the most toxic pre-medical school website you can ever find. But the good news is a lot of people do report interview questions. So a lot of the times, medical schools tend to reuse the same questions. So that's a good place to kind of see what the style of questions are. And, like SDN, Reddit is another one that has a lot of questions. So oftentimes I'll just Google, like NJMS Reddit and see what comes up. But the main thing to do to prepare is to practice. A lot of people, I think, like to kind of write out their answers first, but writing it out is not the same as speaking. And a lot of the times when I have students transition from writing out their answers to practicing with me, it feels completely different. And they spend, hours and hours crafting these answers, but they're not able to speak, right? So practicing with someone is very important. And I will say that not all interview prep companies are the same. A lot of them do hire medical students like myself, but the advice is actually very different from person to person. And I think for me, coming from a business background and having conducted my own interviews and understanding what I'm looking for as a manager, versus, a medical student who hasn't had that experience, who only has experience just interviewing at medical schools, the advice is very different. So, just make sure if you are going to go with a company, you want to make sure to check their background and see what kind of experience they have, not just in medical school, but also outside of it.
Cool. And one thing, going back to practicing, and exactly what Darlene said too, I always tell my kids I am like fluent in Spanish in my head, but then whenever I actually speak it, I can't speak it at all, because in your head you always know better than you are. And so that is really why practice is so key, and not just going through things. Even if it's like to a mirror and saying it out loud is better than nothing.
Absolutely. For open file and closed file, these are the two types of systems we'll use. For open file, it just means that your interviewer will have the application in front of them as they're interviewing you, so they can see everything. That means you should be prepared to answer anything in a lot of detail: research, clinical work, volunteer, and especially bad grades. When I'm saying bad grades, I don't mean, oh, I got an A-. I mean, you got like a D or an F, right? You have to be ready to explain those. And I will say, if you've made it that far to an interview, even with a bad grade, my advice is they don't even care about that bad grade. They just want to see that you've been able to overcome it, right? And that you've grown from that experience. For closed file, they're blinded to everything in your application, which means they don't see your personal statements, they don't see your activities, they don't see your grades. And the reason why we highlighted strengths and weaknesses is because this is the best time to kind of bring those things out. I always tell students, whether it's open or file, just pretend it's always closed file, right? The one mistake you can make is if you tell your interviewer, as you may have seen in my application, right? You don't actually know how much of the application they had the time to read, or, maybe they just saw it 10 minutes ago, they kind of glanced over, maybe just an activities list, right? So you always want to act as if they haven't seen it and explain things thoroughly to them. And the last piece of advice for this slide is to make sure you understand who you're interviewing with. It can really be anyone from the school, right? Not just faculty. It could be an admissions counselor. It could be with students. And I've even interviewed at places where I had community members, right? People who aren't even affiliated with the school, but they were so closely tied with the community that the school brought in community members to interview us.
Crazy, crazy. Right. So now that you're kind of getting to the interview stage, the good news is that you've likely laid a lot of groundwork for the interviews, just based on like the essays that you've already written. Like you probably have written stuff about overcoming a challenge for your essays, or a diversity story, strengths and weaknesses, your most significant activities or clinical experience and things like that. And so it's okay if you draw upon, previous things that you've sent to school or that you've talked about in essays, because if they didn't even get the essay on that, they wouldn't even know about it. And two, you probably did a really good job writing your essays in the first place. And so reuse and recycle things that you've already done. But you definitely want to make sure you do have like a really good example for all of these types of stories. And just like recognizing too that sometimes stories can be used for multiple different types of answers. And so that's why sometimes whenever kids get into like the resources guide and like hear a question, like for example, if it was like, the strengths and weakness question, and they're asking, they might not ask, what are your strengths? They might say like, how would your teachers describe you? Or how would your friends describe you? And kids can get kind of caught up in that, because then they're like, oh God, I have to think about what my teachers would say about me. But those could just be your strengths. And so that's the important thing to think about as you're preparing these stories, is like, what type of answers or what type of questions could I use these answers for? And you do want to have like a fleshed out story for all of these types of questions too. One thing that I always remind kids too, it like sometimes will feel like they're talking forever. And they only talked for like 30 seconds. So you don't want to necessarily sell yourself short by feeling like you're talking forever, rushing through the story and leaving out key details, which is once again why it's really important to say things out loud to make sure you're not missing those key details, and just getting the wording down and, helping with the story flow and not forgetting any key facts. But then also, on the other side, you don't want to talk for 7 minutes about nothing. Because if your interview is only 20 minutes and you talk about 7 minutes for something that's not really necessary, sometimes you do need to edit yourself if you just keep repeating over and over again. Now, the one thing that you'll likely have to do for every single school, because it's not something necessarily you can make up on the spot, is why you're interested in this school, why you're interested in this program, or something like that. And even like why you're interested in this med school. So for every BSMD interview, like the traditional interview, you should be preparing those types of questions or answers, because you can almost guarantee that they will be asking something like this. And if it is in a more rural area, they might be asking you why you want to attend this school, like what's drawing you to this location, what's your interest in going to a more rural location. And so kind of having that already prepared too can just help it go a little bit smoother. So these questions are really more to just help guide you through that process and make sure that, almost every single interview will have something along these lines. And so just to make sure that you're prepared, think about these stories as you go through the process. And you'll see a lot of like our interview prep questions that we have kind of in the middle here. You can use something along these lines with these stories that you'll be able to use. Okay.
So, sorry. So like we mentioned in the other slide for strengths and weaknesses, this is a question that you can pretty much always expect to come up. Most people really don't have the problem with the strengths because, everyone's very comfortable talking about things that they're good at, right? But the one thing that I have seen everybody struggle on is the weakness, because everyone's like freaking out, like how do I make it still sound good even though it's a weakness, right? So, as a STEM student, I always see people say, "Oh, I work too hard," or, "I'm just such a perfectionist," right? And you can kind of expect at least half the interviewees to say something along these lines. But it's not bad to actually have a real weakness and be able to recognize it, right? So medical schools are looking for someone who is mature, who's able to self-reflect. So when they are asking this question, they don't want to hear, "Oh, I'm such a perfectionist," and that's actually a pro and a con, right? Trust me, it's been said many, many times. So that's why we kind of created a list here that are practical, right? But the key point to overcome the weakness, or to show them that you've overcome the weakness, is to give examples, right? So for example, if, let's take the first one. If you are always nervous in front of talking to people, well, you can say, I've joined speech and debate, and this has really helped me come out of my shell. And it kind of forces me to talk in front of a bigger audience. Or maybe I joined a club where I have to lead in front of a group of people, and this has really helped me, again, learn how to speak in front of people, right? And these skills are important because as a doctor, I have to communicate with, not just my patients, but sometimes in front of a body of people. So, that's just one example of how you can state a weakness and you can see it doesn't really say anything bad about me, right? It's just me acknowledging a flaw and showing that I do recognize the flaw and I have taken the steps to overcome that flaw.
Perfect. Okay. So then some other do's and don'ts of the application process. And this is true for both traditional and MMI. But essentially, you can probably guess what a lot of these do's are. And it's, we always want students to be positive throughout the entire time, even if it is a long day. Keeping up, the Zoom energy is really key. But ultimately, be yourself. Be polite and be respectful to everyone. You never know exactly who's going to be interviewing you later on. So if it is in person, making sure that you are on the entire time you're there. And same thing for like any Zoom calls you might have, just being on, even in a student Q&A, or like when you're watching a video, you're not like obviously playing on your phone and things like that, or disengaged, because they might notice that and like take note of who's actually excited to be there and things like that. And so during the actual interview, try and maintain eye contact as much as possible if it's virtual, or if it's in person. In person's obviously a little bit easier, but try and make that connection with that person, even if it is virtual. And ultimately, too, the one thing that they're really testing you on is not really your academic ability, as Darlene said before, because they already have decided that you are strong enough. Regardless of kind of what your grades are at that point, they've decided you are qualified. And at this point, they do want to see that you are someone that would fit on campus. And so by being positive, by ultimately being yourself, you can really showcase who you'd be on campus and if you'd be a good fit. And so, of course, throughout the interview, if they do ask you about a challenge or a failure, don't necessarily push that onto other people. If you did make a mistake, it's okay. Take like ownership of like your failure, of your challenge, or whatever it might be. And one thing too that I've noticed that my students will do is they'll think that they have to be super mature in their interview. And then they almost come off as wooden. They don't sound passionate or excited about this, or about the interview, about the fact that they're like, could become on the pathway to becoming a doctor. And so that's another thing. It's like, don't pretend to be the person that you think that they want to be. It's much better to be yourself and to showcase who you are. because that's who they want to be seen in these interviews. Already mentioned the phones. Definitely don't even have it kind of around you and in front, because even on virtual, we can still usually tell when people are on their phones or, not paying attention and things like that. So just avoid distractions on that front. And then, as Darlene said before, don't be afraid to showcase your weaknesses. It's okay. This is what an interview is for, to figure out how you handle failure, because as a doctor, as a med school student, you're going to fail. It's going to be hard. And so they want to make sure that you are able to handle that, which is ultimately why they're asking some of those kinds of questions. Okay.
All right. So now we're going to go through some common interview style questions and kind of walk you guys through how we would approach these questions. So one of the first questions most interviews will ask is, tell me about yourself, right? And people kind of want you to lead the conversation, and that's why they ask this. So the biggest mistake that I see, especially for STEM students, they really like to repeat all of their accomplishments, right? So sometimes, in my interview preps, if it's longer than 5 minutes, I'll just stop them because we're not really getting anywhere. But the one mistake you can do is to repeat your resume. Normally, I like to tell students to start with like an elevator pitch and kind of limit this to 30 seconds, right? And, an elevator pitch is kind of like going through the different levels of yourself, but it's a highlight, right? I never said the elevator stopped. I'm saying the elevator is going up, right? That means, you don't want to, say, hi, I'm Darlene. I am a research student, and this is my research, and then spend 5 minutes talking about it, right? I want to say, hi, I'm Darlene. One of my favorite things to do is to binge Netflix and teach myself about finance, right? And then throw in like an interesting detail about yourself to make yourself memorable. The one thing I always point out is, if you always point out research, you always point out community service, well, think about everyone else who has done the same thing to get into medical school. So if they're interviewing 500 students, well, you kind of just got lost in that pile. I remember one of the people I was interviewing with said that he really liked motocross, right? So you can imagine, not everyone's going to say that answer. So automatically he really stood out. So you always want to provide some interesting fact about yourself. What do you do for fun? People kind of get confused about this question, but they really want to know, what do you do for fun? Are you a normal human being, or do you like to sit in the research lab and do you sleep there, right? And if you are the latter, these people tend to burn out very quickly, right? They only understand work. They don't understand what a mental break is. But, if you are entering your journey into medicine, you'll realize, and you'll hear this a lot, it's really a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. So that means you have to give yourself mental breaks, right? So what better way to give yourself mental breaks than to do things with your friends or family, doing things that you enjoy, right? For me, it's really napping, watching TV. I'm a couch potato if I'm not outside. I wish it was more interesting, but it's really not.
It's funny.
And then for the last question, for strengths and weaknesses, we kind of talked about this already. And again, I really emphasize, we really created a whole slide to kind of emphasize why the weakness part was so important. But for strengths, you do want to match your strengths to the school. So they like, leadership, innovation. Those are kind of the strengths that you want to point out to kind of show them that your mission aligns with theirs.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So a few other interview questions, kind of like what we talked about before too, like explain something bad. And so this could be like, is there anything on your application that you want to explain, or what's a challenge or a time you failed and things like that. And so this is definitely a time not really to see what's wrong with you per se, but more just to see if you learn from mistakes. Just like what we talked about with weakness, what Darlene spoke at length is they're not really seeing what your problem is how are you trying to overcome that problem, essentially, because everyone's going to have a weakness, everyone is going to fail. And so ultimately they want to make sure you're a well-adjusted human, you're constantly trying to learn from yourself too. And so those are kind of key too. Now these are always kind of more interesting, which are the weird questions. And you won't have like really an answer for these. And so one thing to not get caught up is there's really no right or wrong answer. Like if it's what utensil would you be and you said a knife and then halfway through you're like, oh, that was stupid, I actually feel like I would be a fork. It doesn't necessarily matter what you are. It's more of like the reason behind what you say. And even if half your personality is a fork and half of it's a spoon, because I think Darlene uses a spork as an example, which could totally work. You could say whatever you want to say. It doesn't matter if they ask you what kind of color it is or what color you would be. I've had kids get asked, like, if you were to go viral for anything, what would it be? Doesn't matter what it is. Just like, as long as you come up with something. And if you come up with something way better when you're taking a shower later, that's okay too. It doesn't matter. They're not going to know your better answer anyway. So just coming up with an answer is better than no answer for sure for these types of things. Okay.
All right. What would you be if you could not be a doctor? I feel like this one always throws people off because they're like, I've always wanted to be a doctor, so I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, the trick here is to kind of find something interesting, right? That kind of has similar qualities to a doctor. I think the next step would be like, oh, I'm going to do research, right? But if you think about every other STEM student applying, their next step is always going to be research. So, for me, I would say like, I don't know if anyone watches The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, but I said I would like to be the host of that show because I really like to use my skills to help, people find love and help, or just, be there to listen to their problems and help guide them, right? So those are actually the same qualities as what a doctor actually does. But my answer is a lot more memorable than, oh, I want to do those things in research. For current events, this can be kind of high yield. I would say it's more high yield if you are applying traditionally, not a BSMD program. But, I will never say never because I've seen a lot of these type of questions be brought up even to BSMD interviews. The main one is, be able to explain Medicaid versus Medicare. And I really like, the dirty medicine ethics videos and just knowing current events, right? I kind of lump these all together because they can ask any sort of question in this realm, right? Whether it's the healthcare system, ethics, what's happening in Israel versus Palestine, right? It could be very random. So, they kind of want you to be able to know what's happening in the world. And it's just another way for them to see, do you always have like your nose in the book, or do you also know about different issues that are happening, right? So being a doctor doesn't necessarily mean you're just doing medicine. You have to be aware of a lot of different social issues too. So that's why this question, is a pretty popular one. Where else are you applying? This is probably the one that trips up people the most. And, schools, I think, like to do it because they like to be mean and they want to see, how they rank compared to every other school on your list. But the key here is, you don't have to list every single school that you're applying to, right? but you also don't want to say, oh, you are the only school, because they know you're lying. They know you applied to probably 15 schools. So I usually say, you can tell them 3 to 5, but, list schools that kind of have a similar strength, right? Maybe that school strength is preventative care, then you can list some other schools that focus on preventative care. And that way it shows them that when you were picking out schools, you actually picked it for a specific reason. You weren't just casting a wide net, right? And trying to see what comes back. Geographical location is also very popular. So I'm from California. So if if I say, oh, I applied to UCSD and UCLA and USC, right? Because these are all very close to each other and I can be close to my family, right? That is, location is like the best reason you can ever bring to a school when they ask you, why are you applying for this school?
Definitely. Okay, so another really common question is going to be your why medicine question. Why do you want to be a doctor question? And so you can almost guarantee in a BSMD interview, they are going to ask you something along those lines. And so, similar to your why doctor essay, you're going to structure it in a similar way because you had a lot of stories to back it up. You didn't just say, oh, I wanted to be a doctor since I was 7. Like I like helping people. I like science. Like it's really great. No, you had stories about, healthcare experiences, clinical experiences, shadowing, like what you saw, maybe like what was your initial spark, but then like how you've kept that spark alive essentially for the 5-10 years, however long it's been since you decided you wanted to be a doctor. That's key too, is to really be showcasing your passion for the field, but then not just, not just the healthcare field in general. Why you want to become a doctor, like why not a nurse or a physician assistant or, a pharmacist or whatever it might be. And so sometimes you will get explicitly asked, like, why not those things? And so making sure you do think that through whenever you were shadowing, if you saw how, like, the doctor was interacting with everyone else, or, how the doctor was able to interact with the patients in a way that the nurse or the pharmacist couldn't, and like their commitment to the long-term care and things like that, or the kind of control over the power too. So that would all be things to have the stories to back it up and kind of showcase that you do understand what the role of physician means and not just someone in the healthcare field. This one's going to be a super important one, just because you want to make sure that you do really showcase why medicine and how it should be. And so oftentimes this one is a little bit longer of an answer. Once again, students always think that this answer is super long and they've been talking for maybe a minute. But this one, you might have kind of multiple facets to it. And so it's okay to go into it a little bit more because you want to have those stories. And then we're going to talk a lot about ethic questions for the MMI interview. But if they do kind of ask you like a more ethical dilemma, you always want to support your answer to showcase how you got to that way of thinking and kind of why you didn't go down different paths as well. And so kind of looking at those pillars of medicine can be super helpful. And actually, I'm going to throw it to Darlene, and she can talk more about ethics.
So ethics is something that is really hard because these are kind of scenarios that you don't really think about in your everyday life, but they just want to see how you think about things logically. So, there's not really a good way to practice because there's so many different types of questions when it comes to ethics, but kind of understanding how to approach ethics, what the next step is, that's really where, interview prep comes in handy because we can walk you through, what the answer choices are. But, the best thing is evidence-based medicine, right? Again, at this level, at a high school level, they don't expect you to know that much about medicine. But being able to say, the first thing I'm going to do is ask my patient about this, right? Gather some more information or, help them figure out what the next step is, right? That's kind of what they're looking for. One of the things that I think I might be the only person who ever brings this up, is the pillars of medicine. But I really think that it's so important when it comes to ethics because, I really bring it up because these are the principle of ethics in medicine, right? But again, at this level, do they expect you to know all these things? Not really. But if you're able to understand them and kind of use these principles in your answer, it really does make your answer stronger, and it kind of guides you towards the right answer, right? Even if you don't know what the right answer actually is. So with ethics, a lot of the times you'll see, there's not really a right answer.
Yes.
There usually is a right answer, but there's different laws you have to know. It's really complicated, but again, this is why interview prep really does help, because we can sit there and guide you, through the answer, because there's multiple steps that you have to take before you're done with the question.
Yeah, and showing that steps too is super key, and what sometimes students will forget. But yeah, completely agree.
So for DO schools, a lot of DO schools, just from my experience, because I go to a DO school, when I was interviewing, that for the essay portion and for the interview portion, they're like, why DO? Why not MD? Well, if you wanted to do that, MDs can do that. Why didn't you just apply to all MD schools? That sounds like you want to be an MD, right? So they really want you to know about the osteopathic principles, and there's such a huge emphasis, right? Because, as we all know, there's that sort of bias. So they also want you to know, I've had many schools ask me this, can you recite the 4 osteopathic tenets? And you have to recite them in the right order, right? You can't just say, oh, I know one of them. You have to know all 4 of them. So DO schools are a little bit more tricky. But once you're actually in the school, we really learn the same things as an allopathic school. And then we learn our osteopathic techniques. But other than that, they're just you guys are kind of the same. They don't really put the emphasis anymore. But yeah, just for DO schools, just make sure you know why DO, what the principles are, what the tenets are.
For sure. Yes, so true.
So for underserved populations, we wanted to bring out a specific slide for this because a lot of the medical schools are underserved focused. So if you interview at a school and you see that they do focus on primary care, rural areas, underserved areas, you really want to have a concrete answer about why you're planning to go to the underserved, right? Every school will ask you this question because they want to make sure your intentions are true, that you're not just going to the school, getting your education, and then going back to the big city where there's already a lot of doctors. Underserved populations means that there's not enough access to doctors, right? And there's a lot of different barriers. Money is usually one of them, right? Location is usually another one. And, cultural barriers like, language or religion, this can determine the right treatment plan for the patient. Access to care is another thing that I usually spend a lot of time talking about with students. I usually dedicate a whole session to this just because I really want to make sure that people understand what it means. And, at first I really thought it was overkill, but, as more and more of my students have gone on to interviews, they've actually been asked about underserved populations and what the issues are. And so I'm really glad that I actually took the time to go over that because, especially again, at a high school level, you're not really expected to know it, but if you are able to talk about it very thoroughly, it really does make you stand out because I can guarantee you none of your peers know about underserved medicine unless, somehow they are from an underserved area or they've been in, they've worked in an underserved healthcare setting. So knowing about these issues, if you are interviewing in an underserved focused school, I highly recommend to learn about these issues.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, does anyone have any questions about traditional interviews? We can move on now in the last few minutes. I can't believe time has flown by so quickly to talk about MMI a little bit too. I saw that there was a question earlier about which programs have MMIs. And the good news is not a ton. There are some that have them, like the ones that we could think of off the top of our heads before was like the Albany Medical College schools. So Union, RPI, Siena, they are doing MMI even virtually. VCU's got a MMI. I couldn't remember if Temple does MMI. Did you come up with any other names, Darlene, that have MMI? And we can always come back to this too.
Not off the top of my head. It was just VCU and Albany for me.
Yeah, because SUNY Upstate used to do them, but once they became virtual, it looks like they've stopped doing it. My students who've got SUNY Upstate interviews this way are just traditional. So, and same thing, St. Bonaventure. There's like rumors online that it was virtual, or sorry, that was MMI before, but at least the first round this year is just traditional. So really not a ton. You might go through and get 5 interviews and none of them be MMI. So a little bit easier because you don't have to prep 2 very different things. So for those who are maybe wondering what we're talking about, MMI is the multiple mini interview. And this one's a little bit more intensive. In my opinion, it definitely requires a little bit extra preparation because it's not going to be your typical interview. Each format is going to be a little bit different based on school, but they're roughly all the same. Just depends on the number of stations, how long the stations are, and that kind of thing. But usually you'll go to like anywhere from like 6 to 10 or so stations, have about 8 minutes at each station to answer whatever the scenario or prompt is. And so this can be a little bit intimidating because you're not going to have kind of your standard questions that you can guess you're going to have to answer, like the tell me about yourself and those types of things, because it's really going to be not about you per se. It's going to be more about how you would react to these situations. And of course, you can kind of use your stories to showcase how you would react in those situations. But more so, it's going to be a lot about what Darlene was talking about with ethics, where you really have to understand more like knowledge issues about patient confidentiality or cultural competence. And so kind of having the 4 pillars of medicine and things like that can also really help inform your answers because those can be the pillars later on for your answers. So those would be things you'll definitely want to be reviewed. The good news is you will not be tested on like your science or medical knowledge. They're not going to ask you how to do a certain procedure or what medicine a doctor should be administrating in a particular situation because you're 1 in high school and 2, even if you were in college, how would you know those types of things? So those are kind of the good things is you can rest easy. It's more going to be like how you would react in those situations. And there's really no one right or wrong answer a lot of the times. You can have a right answer and just show your work and how you would get to that kind of answer. What we were talking about before with the ethical dilemma type things, because that's very similar to MMI. We really want to showcase how we're getting to those answers, what our thought process is, why we thought something was the right path, and why we discarded something as kind of not as strong of an answer or whatever it might be. So I see we have a couple questions, so we can go ahead and answer those now. So when are the interviews usually held? Right now. So I think the first ones started, would you say beginning of January? I think January 6th was like my first years for students.
I started doing prep for students in November. November and December were really like busy for me.
That's actually what, as soon as you said that, I forgot. There are some like Evansville and like Colorado. Yeah, they were beginning of December. You're right. Okay. Yep. So outliers in December as well. I would say the majority maybe are January through March.
Yeah. I would say even April is kind of like your last month that you'll see interviews.
I think I wasn't my student, it was another counselor's student. Her student had like an interview, I think it was like April 20th or something for the Baylor program. So it could be super late. Or she found out April 20th. I can't quite remember what it was, but it was very, very late in the process. So yeah, now is kind of the time come senior year.
Yeah. And I will say, practice early. Don't wait until you get the interview invite to start practicing.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because sometimes you only get like a week of lead time. And if you've got like a really busy school schedule or things like that, or you are working with someone or you haven't worked with someone, you're trying to find a company to work with, it can be a lot to have to prep in a very short amount of time. As Darlene knows, she has been working with a student that started working with us on Tuesday, and his interview's on Friday. So it's just been a rush, trying to get everything ready to go. So preparing early is a good idea.
Yes.
And now another really good question. Are there any schools where an applicant is interviewed with other applicants at the same time? I would say rarely. I can think of Nova's DO program. They do have like a group interview. And sometimes she'll be in like Q&As with other students, but I don't think I'd really count that. Can you think of any group interviews?
LeCom had a group interview, but I don't know how it changed after COVID.
Yeah, I think they only are doing that like video this year. So yeah, not very often will there be group interviews, thank God, because I think they're a little bit awkward, especially on Zoom. So I think it's a good thing. And the last one is resources for MMI practice. Yes, if you go on our website, and I'll send the link in a minute, and I sent it before as well, you can find our guide for MMI and then also traditional interview and everything too. Okay, so I'm going to keep on moving, and then if you have any questions, of course, we can pause again. I kind of jumped the gun because I explained the format a little bit before, but just to kind of reiterate, this is just like the typical MMI format. And the good news is, like, a school is never going to surprise you with an MMI interview. You're never going to just show up and they're like, good luck, like, here's your MMI. They're going to tell you very explicitly beforehand that it's either MMI or it's not. And so if they don't say it's MMI, then you don't have to worry about it. But typically 6 to 10 stations or so. Usually you'll get like about 2 minutes to read the prompt and then to start like formulating and brainstorming your question. And then anywhere from like 6, honestly, maybe even to 10 minutes to answer the prompt. And they'll ask you follow-up questions along the way. So you don't have to necessarily fill those 8 minutes, just you talking the first time. They'll, ask you different prompts and, maybe introduce different ideas and how would you respond in this different situation and things like that. And the good news is too, it's not the same person asking you all of the 10 questions, all different scenarios. You're going around, maybe virtually, maybe in person, from station to station. And so it's going to be a closed file. You're just going to be basically like a number to them. They're not going to know anything about you. And so that also can be a really big advantage. So like maybe you feel like you did not do your best on one station, you get a complete redo in the next because now this person doesn't know that you didn't do great on the previous one, and you have like a new first impression. And so that's kind of, I think, the bonus of this type of interview is you can keep, it's like 50 first dates. You always have like a new first date that you can really go to and see and make a really good first impression. So don't necessarily let it get in your head if you didn't do as well as you hoped. Okay.
Sorry. So for the MMI, I think it's important to understand what they're looking for, right? So back all the way up to the top of our presentation, we talked about the AAMC competencies, and these kind of look for the same thing. So remember when I said They're looking more for like the intrapersonal skills, like how do you work in a team? How are you able to communicate with patients? Well, this is where MMI really comes in handy for the schools. So they're really looking for people who are able to communicate, how they are able to work with other people, right? Whether that's, again, your team member or your patient, a colleague. And the way they do this is they give you different scenarios, like Lindsay had mentioned in the previous slide. And, sometimes you are going back and forth with, they call it like a standardized patient or like an actor, and they'll kind of act out a scenario so that they're, giving you answers as you're talking to them. But they really are looking for all of these qualities that are listed on here. And, again, the most important part is the communication aspect, being able to articulate exactly what you are going to do, what you are going to say, how are you logically thinking about what the next step is. And, a lot of these can be ethical issues. It could be medical problems, non-medical problems. It could be, again, random questions, like the weird questions that we had talked about earlier. So the hard part about MMI is there's so much information that can really just come out of the left field. They can ask you anything from anywhere. But, the approach for MMI is still the same. Being just clear and concise, being able to communicate, articulate things clearly, that is really what's important.
Yes, for every type of interview too.
Yes.
Which is why practice is so key. And that leads me to the next slide, which is how to prepare for the MMI. And so because there are really no like interview questions where we're positive it's going to appear or pretty positive it's going to appear, it is just important to get used to the format and practice within the format too. And so the first thing is, like, whenever you do have your practice like scenarios, to use the format that the class or the interview is asking you. And so if it's 8 minutes, if it's 6 minutes, if it's 10, kind of following that format in your prep. So you do have a couple minutes usually to like analyze what your answer will be. And so that is super key as well. Before you start speaking, develop a mental outline and just really figure out what the station is asking you and what they're trying to figure out how you respond in certain situations. And so that's going to be really key and almost more important than really sometimes what your answer is you really have to make sure that you understand what they're trying to ask you, because that will also help dictate what your answer is going to be ultimately too. Now, one other thing that we also want you to do is going back to your ethics. So really review those, because those will help inform which way you're going to go with your answers. And so we really want you to review those and to really fall back on those whenever you're in a situation where you don't really understand. And once again, they're not expecting you to understand 100% of everything or have all the right answers. This is more just to see how you would respond in situations. Are your ideas ethical at least? And it's okay, like, if you are incorrect, because you're a teenager, you're expected to kind of grow and evolve. As long as you're not completely immoral, I guess you should say, we're still going to learn. It's okay if, like, it's not the best answer. As long as you do understand like the ethics behind things ultimately is what I guess I should say. So still be ethical, but okay if it's not 100% correct or you don't know the right answer, and you can admit that. Now, one thing that we always suggest too that students do it when you are doing your practice scenarios, whenever you are beginning to answer your question, is the first thing is just to repeat the prompt, like paraphrase the prompt back to the person who's interviewing you as well. This can be really helpful to make sure that you know what the question is answering, to kind of gear you up to making sure you are getting the right answer as well. And so it just kind of helps also you orient yourself and get the ball rolling. And so you can just be like, okay, so from my understanding, the situation is this correct? Repeat the scenario back at them. They'll say yes. You can always ask follow-up questions too if like you have a question about what something is, or like how who you are in the situation and things like that. You can ask those types of questions too. And the interviewer can help, kind of guide you in the right way too. But practice is really key. And even like those stories that we were talking about on the stories to prepare, like if they are asking you about like how you would respond in like a group project, you can bring up stories from your personal life too, because you can be like, well, whenever I did work in a challenging group project, here is how I dealt with it, and it can just add to your answer. You don't want to add a story that doesn't make any sense with it, but if it is like something that is relevant to what they're asking, you can go ahead and answer that. So the challenge essay or the failure essay or a leadership example, those all could very well come into play here at the MMI as well. And so you can use that work and double the place ultimately, which is really the goal. Because even though they're not asking about your experiences, it can be a good way of really showing how you would be a good fit on campus by, showing rather than just telling them how you would react to these types of situations. Okay. So kind of have some sample questions for you. And so these are questions that I had a student had. I can't remember which school it was. But just so you can kind of get an idea of what type of questions. Oops. Sorry, I realized I switched on my PowerPoint, but not actually on the right PowerPoint. Here we go. So these are just a couple follow-up scenarios. So then you can see also, how they might change the direction with these questions. And so this first one's kind of a simple question. A good doctor treats the disease. A great doctor treats the patient with the disease. What does this quote mean to you? And so this, is, I think it was either at AMC or VCU, one of those two. They asked this question. And so you can kind of see here that it was, kind of an open-end question. You could bring in your own experiences. You could kind of talk about how you've seen when you're shadowing a great doctor and how they interacted with their patients. If you have like some healthcare experiences that relate to it, go for it and kind of talk it through and showcase who you are. And so you can kind of see with their follow-up questions, how they could change the direction and what they want you to think about. And it could be a wide variety of different things ultimately that they're asking. And so you have 8 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it might be to talk about, these certain questions. And so I have had students where they might have just 2 or 3 follow-up questions prepared. And if you finish it after 6 minutes and it went for 8, they might ask you, do you have anything to add? And you say no, then the interview might be done. So you don't necessarily want to fluff up your answers, but if they did want you to talk about what experiences and qualities are most important for medical students to have, and then you only talk about experiences, but you don't talk about qualities, then you're really only answering half their question. And so making sure that you are answering the full prompt is going to be really key to making sure that you do have like a robust answer at the end of the day. Okay. Now, anything you want to add to this, Darlene?
I don't think so. I think your explanation was really thorough.
Yeah, maybe too thorough. The next one. So this one's like a little bit more of like an ethical dilemma, or I don't know if ethics is the right word for it, a dilemma. Situation. Do you think it's acceptable for patients to request physicians of the same gender? And so that would be kind of the first prompt that they would have. And so in your 2 minutes where you can initially think about it, that might be, you might wonder a little bit more, or, kind of think when it would be acceptable, maybe when it's not acceptable, and those types of things too. And so whenever you do start to answer your question, you can look down these multiple scenarios of like, it's a religious reason, or if you're going to take the gynecologist, if it's for comfort reasons or whatever it might be, or maybe due to like trauma for, once again, if you want to see the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever it might be. And then same thing for these, they'll ask like, follow-up questions like, what is there a physician shortage? And so there might not be a good answer for this. Like there might not ultimately be anything you can do as a physician, but ultimately like you're going back to your, your pillars of medicine with like autonomy, making sure that the patient ultimately can control their treatment, and like you give them all the resources they have and all the knowledge they can have, but they can decide if they want the treatment or don't want the treatment, and if they want it from you or don't want it from you. And so you can do everything possible, but just making sure that you're kind of validating their concerns and understanding them and listening. But ultimately, they might leave the situation unhappy, like if there's just no other options. And that's kind of where follow-up question number 2 comes into play. If the patient's request is denied, how will this impact care? And so this, once again, kind of makes you think about, it's always not always going to be a great patient interaction. They might not want to be there. They might not want to talk to you. It could just because of something arbitrary. It could be something racial because of your gender. And so figuring out, how you will deal with patients who don't maybe want to listen to you, and how you as a physician would make sure that they are getting the best care possible, and thinking those things through is going to be super key. Anything you want to add for this one?
I guess I would just say when you're approaching these questions, just start really broad and then narrow down your answer, right? So think of every possibility, right? It's open-ended for a reason. So a lot of the times when I'm first prepping students for MMI, they kind of jump straight into it's like as if like it's a yes or no question, right? But it's asking, do you think, right? It didn't say, is this a yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
So before we talked about taking a stance, and that is important, but again, you have to think about all the different possibilities out there and then be ready to, take all the different possibilities, right? It's almost as if you're like playing lawyer, right? You have to present all the options available and then kind of think like, well, what could they counter with, right?
Yeah.
And that's why these questions are so tricky.
Yeah. And you could totally say, like, in this type of situation, here's how I would react. And in this type of situation, this is a better reaction. Because it does depend on like what the patient does. You can't necessarily control their actions at all. But yeah, thinking things through is super key. And this kind of actually goes a little bit hand in hand. I'm going to skip over to one of these questions that we had, which is about the Casper. Not a lot of BSMD programs do the Casper. I think Hofstra is the only one who requires it before the interview, like for all their applicants.
I think Drexel, whichever one leads to Temple, that one I think does it too.
Drexel does, but I think you have to get the interview first.
Oh, that's a lot nicer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's the only difference. I believe that's the difference. I think they said that on their website. And then UIC used to require it, but now they don't. And I think Texas Tech might require it, but it's one of the Texas schools. Not very many require it. Honestly, a lot of what we've been talking about today, ethics, talking things through, looking at different scenarios, applies for the Casper too. So once again, multiple work can go to multiple places. So it's kind of nice. Okay. Let me skip ahead.
All right. So when I was on the interview trail, I think one of the things I always got confused about is how much stuff should I actually bring? So ID is definitely a must. I think almost every school will tell you to bring ID. But I guess during my first interview, I didn't realize how long it was. So highly recommend water because sometimes they don't provide you water. So, it could be 8 hours, it could be 4 hours. Sometimes I think they usually let you know how long. But for me, I thought I would be able to find water, but I wasn't. And then notebook and pen is always good to be able to take notes. One thing that I think people really underutilize is taking notes in the interview. This is so important because, I think when you're nervous, well, at least when I'm nervous, I tend to forget things. So I think it makes a lot of sense to write down the question. And, if you get nervous, you can always like look back down at what you wrote, right? And or if they're asking the question and you think of an idea, you can also write that down and then talk about that. The next one is more optional. Extra copies of your CV or your resume Sometimes they have it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they want it, sometimes they're like, no, we are not allowed to take it, right? But, you never know who you're going to meet, when you're interviewing. So sometimes just having this can be a good idea. Comfortable shoes is a must. I think for girls, worse than guys, the shoes can really make a difference. Okay, so let me tell you, invest in some good shoes. This is one of the mistakes I made. So now I'm telling you guys, wear comfortable shoes. Band-aids, like I wish I had band-aids, especially for newer shoes. And just because I worked in dermatology, if you use Vaseline kind of where it's tight or where it's chafing, it can kind of relieve that. So that's why I always carry a little, those like little mini Vaselines now. I always bring those with me. And then for interviewing, I always recommend to bring 3 questions for your interviewer. When I interviewed people for like a job, one of the things I really hated was when people didn't come prepared, right? And I had candidates that I really liked all the way up until I asked, do you have any questions for me? And they said no. And that was my automatic, like, this person is not going to get hired. Mm-hmm. And so I always recommend coming with questions prepared because you want to seem like you did your research, right? You want to seem interested. If there's so many different things about the school that you don't know, right? And if you don't ask them, they think, well, this person doesn't really care about the school. So I always recommend that.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of to that end too, going back to the notebook and pen, you can write your questions down beforehand if you're going to forget, because you might forget in the interview kind of stress. And especially if it is virtual, like you can have a pen and paper there too and have that written down, your questions, and write down their answers too. And so like you can reference it in your thank you note or whatever it might be. Okay, so what to do the night before. So this is, honestly, some of this advice is for both, but the first one is really important, is to sleep, to not stress too much about it, because at that point you'll be 100% prepared. And so I always tell students kind of the day of, just get the cobwebs out of the vocal cords a little bit, the morning of, and just, review maybe a 1 or 2 questions. But at that point, you've got it. If you are in person, do go out as much as possible, depending on COVID situations too. But, if you're in a local area, especially more of a rural small place, go to something that's not corporate, because I have heard of students getting asked what did you do last night and things like that. And so that would be kind of the main thing to do, something small. And once again, kind of shows that you would fit in there well and you're interested in the town and learning a little bit more about it too. But just something small you could do. Just get dinner at a local place. And then, of course, just review the information about why you want to go to the school, undergrad or BSMD program or med school, whatever the kind of interview is for. Make sure you're prepared for that, and then review your questions or prepare your questions too. And so you definitely don't want to ask questions that are kind of generic and on the website, like, can I major in biology in this program, if it clearly states. So do a little bit of research, kind of dive in a little bit and see if it is something specific about what you could do within the program or what life is like on campus. And you'll usually know who your interviewer is. And so you could do a little bit of research on them and see, are they faculty? Are they a student? Are they a community member? And that can maybe help you decide on your questions a little bit better too. And then no matter if it's virtual or in person too, you're going to want to make sure that you are ready for the interview. And so I always recommend, especially for Zoom calls or actually in-person calls too, you try on the whole outfit before you actually go to the interview. You fly off there or drive there. And then for Zoom, you try on the outfit and then you see how it looks on the Zoom screen too. If you had a dark brown behind you, maybe a dark shirt isn't a good idea, or a white shirt maybe wouldn't be a good idea. It just kind of depends on lighting and everything like that. So just do a dry run beforehand in your outfit. And then try and forget about the interview as much as possible too. Just, you've got it, you've prepared. And so just try and relax a little bit if possible.
So just a recap of everything we've talked about. When you're interviewing, make sure you've reread your personal statement and any supplementals and anything else you've added to the application. Just remember, like we talked about in the first couple slides, they interviewed you because they saw something on your application that they really liked. So kind of reading it over, remembering why you're even here in the first place is always really helpful. And again, they can ask you anything from your application. So it could be, maybe one specific line that you said on your personal statement. It could be an activity. It could be something you said on your secondary. Anything is really fair game. Read up on ethics. Again, ethics is very important. A lot of people struggle with this. So starting early is actually very important because I've tried to do ethics in one interview prep session, and the student left better than he started out as. But I think usually 2 to 3 sessions for ethic is probably necessary, And I'm the type of person where if I don't need to show up, I won't show up for those. But 2 to 3 is usually recommended because there's just so much material to cover. And with each answer, like when I work with students, I'm very detailed. So that's why it takes so long. Read up on the news, know about current events, know about the healthcare system. Practice, of course, is our best advice. And, we didn't really talk about this, but being firm, confident, organized, this really does help set you up for success, right? Confidence, I think, is probably the most important thing. Even if you have no idea what you're talking about, if you are confident, they will believe what you're saying, right? And that's exactly what we want you to be like. And lastly, be professional. Even if it's to the janitor, the minute you walk in to the door and the first person you interact with, every single person matters, whether you think so or not. So highly, highly recommend that.
Cool. So I see we have a couple questions. First one's about the Casper, because we did talk about that, but we did not explain what it was at all. I'm trying to remember what it's like. The test is called like situational judgment test or something.
Mhm.
And it's going to be like really similar where you got like ethical kind of dilemmas, scenarios where you're kind of pushed into it. And then you'll have to do like, is it like 3 questions that you have follow up with it or something like that? It's really similar to the MMI, to be honest.
Yeah, they won't really ask you medical scenarios from what I remember. They're more like everyday scenarios, like you catch someone stealing from the cash register, and it's one of your coworkers. Would you report them, right? And then it kind of guides you like through what the and then they'll say like, oh, the person decided that they never or they didn't want to tell the manager even though you gave them the opportunity. Would you still report them? Things like that. It feels very easy, but again, it's kind of, you have to answer things in a stepwise fashion. And that's where things get tricky to kind of understand, what to do. The worst part I will say about Casper is you could think you did the best job in the world and you will never know how you actually did because you never see the score. It just gets automatically sent to the school.
Well, they've started doing like percentiles, I think, which is maybe worse because now, yeah, this is like new from this year. And so everyone's like, what does it mean? And it's like, it's hard to know what it means because this is like the first year I've ever seen that. And
Yeah.
so, like you're in like quadrants and stuff like that. And it's like, who knows what it actually means. But yeah, that's exactly what it'll be. And you'll see some MMI that are kind of similar, which is nice, at the undergrad or the BSMD level. And I see we have another one about ethics, a list of ethics topics. Do you think this means just like medical ethics?
Yeah. I can see if I can pull up a list real quick, but honestly, there's so many of them. The University of Washington has, I would call it like a starter list, because I've looked at the topics and they do list all the topics, but they don't go as in depth as I would like. So usually I do recommend for students to read it before we start prepping and kind of throughout, like in between the sessions. But like it kind of tells you like what kind of questions could be asked, but it doesn't really tell you how to approach them, if that makes sense. It's called University of Washington Ethics. It's the first link.
Okay, I think you've sent it to other kids before. If you send it in, oh wait, I'll look it up actually. And I can put it in the chat. Yeah, okay. That's a good one.
Here, I'll email it to you and then you can put it in the chat.
Perfect. Oh, I actually got it. One of your other interview prep things. Where am I? Here we go.
Yeah. You know, I will say, like, we did provide some dirty medicine ethics. That's more for medical students. I tell students to watch really specific videos, not all of it, because there's only some information I want them to know. And then even with this one, these are all supplemental, at least from what I've seen. And there's just so much information. If you don't have someone to guide you through everything, it's very overwhelming. And I will say, when I was doing ethics, like studying for ethics while I was interviewing for medical school, it was a lot of information. And I was like, I have no idea like where to start, how to approach these things. And, you know, I wish there was a better guide for that, but unfortunately there's not. So it really does help to have someone kind of walk you through it who understands how like these ethics questions are designed.
Perfect. Yeah. This, okay. So you guys can keep sending in any questions you might have. I'm just gonna go through a few like last minute stuff and kind of tell you about where you can get some of these resources. So on that moonprep.com/resources, we do have the MMI guide, the just traditional BSMD med school interview process guide as well. So tons of resources, as well as like if you are a younger student, the essay ebook we've written and college list guides, tons of stuff on there. So you can find a lot of information there. And of course, we always hope that you come to this webinar feeling like you learned something, that you you were able to learn a little bit more about MMI, about traditional. And so we'd love it if you left us a review. You can leave it on Facebook, you can leave it on Google for us. And so I'll put the link in here for our Facebook, and then Google, you can just type us in as well. If you have any positive feedback, we'd love to see it there. If you have anything you'd like us to improve on, or a topic you'd like us to cover, things like that, you can send us an email too. I'll pop that in the chat as well. And then, of course, like and subscribe to our YouTube page, because we do a ton of these types of interviews. And I see someone's asking if this video will be available to watch later. Yes, it'll be on YouTube forever. And so you can just follow the same link here to find it. And then we do have some like upcoming webinars as well about summer planning. If you are like a med school student, actually applying to med school as well. And then more geared towards older students, kind of reviewing your financial aid letter, and then scholarships for younger students of all ages, really. And then last but not least, just want to remind everyone about our like special offer that we have going on. One interview prep session. It can be either with MMI or traditional interview. You'll get your interview guide with a ton of practice questions. You'll get your feedback. As Darlene talked a lot about ethics, you probably go on a lot of those. And then, of course, we record it. You can watch it over and over again and really get that information whenever you need it. Okay, I think that's it. Do we have any other questions that popped up? I don't think so. Do you have anything you want to add, Darlene?
I don't think so. Just if you have an interview coming up, we wish you the best of luck and we're here to help.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Good luck, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you next time. Have a good night, everyone.